Jeff Jarrett gets a lot of hate from the wrestling community to this day. Some point to his friendship with Vince Russo as a big reason, others say it was stealing Kurt Angle's wife. But mainly, he's seen as a guy who simply wasn't good enough to be in the spot that he was in, often portrayed as a main eventer when most feel he was not worthy of that distinction. Mike Graham in The Rise and Fall of WCW would amusingly state that old slapnuts broke 6,000 guitars and never drew a dime. But that's not entirely true. In fact, Jeff Jarrett brought a lot of money and intrigue to the wrestling business, just not always as a talent. In the mid-2000s, TNA offered a viable alternative to the WWE, and while the company never became a true competitor, it still generated a lot of interest among wrestling fans and offered a viable option for wrestlers to make a living outside of the WWE. But the origins of TNA can be traced all the way back to 1999, because without this single event taking place, TNA would likely not exist today. For a little backstory, Jeff Jarrett had left the WWF in '96 but returned a year later in 1997, signing a 3-year contract with a guaranteed income of $350,000 a year. This is the guaranteed amount that Jarrett would make each year, with show appearances and pay-per-view bonuses to be calculated on top of that amount. This was a fine contract and both parties were happy. For a while. Sadly, Jeff's wife would be diagnosed with breast cancer sometime between October '98 and October '99. Linda McMahon, as the CEO of the WWF at that time, granted Jarrett a reduced schedule to allow him to spend more time with his wife and family. However, despite the worrying circumstances around Jeff's wife, Jim Ross, as head of talent relations, would pressure Jeff into renegotiating his contract in October of 1998. This blindsided Jeff, and with JR and the WWE knowing that Jarrett had no leverage to negotiate with, Double J reluctantly signed a new deal of $250,000, down from his original contract of $350,000. With Jarrett now working fewer shows and with a reduction of $100,000 in yearly income, this put some financial strain on the Jarrett household while facing a difficult time. Understandably, this left a bitter taste in Jeff Jarrett's mouth, and in his words, he felt the gloves were off and he could no longer trust the hand that was feeding him. He would later admit that he did hold a lot of resentment towards JR for this treatment as his wife was battling a serious condition. Fortunately for Double J, he had become good friends with the head writer of the WWF, Vince Russo. He and Russo worked together regularly. Vince Russo is a very polarizing figure in the world of wrestling, with most tending to despise him. But one of his redeeming traits is he preferred to work with the younger up-and-coming stars and push them to the top of the card. Russo's writing style was pretty wild, but some say he performed best when he was reeled in just a little bit by the higher-ups, which is exactly what was happening in the WWF at that time. Russo's ideas, with McMahon overseeing each storyline, led to the WWF battling back in the ratings war against WCW and eventually taking over. All of this ultimately worked out well for Double J. In 1999, he was a legitimate top heel in the company, and this was largely due to his relationship with Russo. In August of 1999, the WWF would introduce SmackDown as its B show, and expected Russo to continue writing for both Raw and now SmackDown. This doubled his workload, taking time away from his family without a pay raise. By October of '99, Vince Russo would resign from the WWF to join the WCW. Before exiting the company, Russo would tell Jeff that if he came with him, he would push him to the main event scene and make him a champion. Jarrett entertained the idea and spoke with Bischoff, who offered him a very lucrative contract. Vince Russo left the WWF in early October, with Jarrett's contract set to expire shortly after on Saturday, October 16th, the day before the No Mercy pay-per-view. Leading up to the contract expiration date, a few things worked out in Jarrett's favor. He was currently the Intercontinental Champion and working a heavily advertised angle with China, who the company was very high on at the time and wanted Jeff to put over strongly. And second, the WWF was about to go public. This meant access to Vince McMahon in the weeks leading up to the pay-per-view was extremely limited, as he was busy with taking the company to the next level. Those left in charge were unable to match the contract that WCW had offered to Jarrett, and no new deal was reached. So Jarrett ultimately decided to leave the company once his contract expired and join WCW. However, there was a small problem. Jarrett was still owed money for months of pay-per-view, TV taping, and house show appearances dating as far back as June earlier that year. This is completely normal. It can sometimes take several months to receive payments and bonuses for their appearances. When you're under contract, you have nothing to worry about. But with Jeff now leaving to join the competitor, the WWF could have easily pocketed what they owed him, and Jeff would never see a dime. Suing the WWF over these unpaid appearances would have likely drowned Jeff in legal fees, so he had to come up with a new strategy. The day of the pay-per-view, Jarrett showed up to the arena, scheduled to work one last match with China, and put her over in a big way. This would mean dropping the IC championship to her cleanly, making her the first woman to hold that belt. But Jarrett was no longer technically under contract with the WWF, which gave him some serious leverage. Either pay what you owe right now, or I'm leaving. Having put a lot of marketing dollars and TV time into this feud, the WWF had to deliver on this match. And with Jeff still in possession of the IC title, they didn't want another Alundra Blaze situation taking place and embarrassing the company once again. So in this instance, as Hardcore Holly would say, Jeff had them bent over a barrel. According to China, she alleges that this was all done on purpose, with Vince Russo intentionally booking the title change to happen at No Mercy specifically, knowing that Jarrett's contract would expire the day before. This may or may not be true, but either way, the timing was certainly ideal for Double J. Jarrett would approach JR the day of the pay-per-view and explain the situation, asking JR to come up with a figure for what they feel they owe him over the last several months. JR would come back with a figure of $150,000, which Jarrett thought was a lowball figure, having done some estimation on his own. Jeff would boldly remind Jim of the contract negotiations the year prior that shorted him on his guaranteed money, and told JR to double the $150K to $300 and take it from the ticket sales of that night. Knowing that cash or a wire transfer wasn't an option on a Sunday, he asked for it to be paid out of the Gund Arena's share of the ticket sales, who were hosting the event. Jarrett knew that if he received a check from the WWF, he would have to wait to cash it on the following Monday, and by then they could easily put a stop payment on it and the check would be worthless. But having the money come from the arena, he was guaranteed to get that money then and there, and that's exactly what happened. Hardcore Holly would write about the incident in his memoir. According to him, the situation wasn't so smooth. He would write, "Backstage, we all could hear the yelling in Vince's office. Shane, Vince's son, was really vocal. He was cussing Jeff out and was ready to beat the shit out of him. Jeff is a mild-mannered guy who wouldn't fight anybody, so he just sat there and held his ground." Jeff Jarrett would later refute these claims, stating that it wasn't anything like that and the negotiations were perfectly reasonable, dealing mostly with JR, who would act as a sort of middleman between Jeff and Vince. Either way, the money would eventually end up in Jarrett's hands and the night would go off without a hitch. He did his job, China won the title, and Double J left for WCW the very next day. Hardcore Holly would state that Jeff had placed his bags by the door before the match and afterwards left the arena without saying a word to anybody. Nobody would see him until he appeared on Nitro the following night. Jeff, however, would state that there were no hard feelings between him and the WWF that night, and they parted ways amicably. Regardless of what version of the story is correct, this peaceful parting of ways wasn't exactly true. Jeff Jarrett, under Vince Russo's guidance, would in fact become a main event star in the WCW. However, just 1 year and 6 months later, the WWF would buy out the entire company, ending the Monday Night Wars. The opening segment to the first Raw after the acquisition would see Vince McMahon cutting a backstage promo about his purchase of the rival company. He would then make his first major announcement regarding WCW's roster, which was the public firing of Jeff Jarrett specifically. Vince stating he spells his name Jeff, but I spell it Gone, gone. Despite Jarrett thinking at the time that this was setting up a major angle between them, this was not the case. Jeff Jarrett had just been legitimately fired on air the very first chance they got, and with that, we wouldn't see Jeff Jarrett in a WWE ring again for nearly 2 decades. With WCW now gone, and Vince McMahon refusing to offer Double J a job, Jarrett was now unemployed with no competitive organization for him to go to. So in 2002, Jeff and his father, Jerry Jarrett, would propose a business plan to investors for a new wrestling promotion to run weekly pay-per-view only events. This would be the very beginning of total non-stop action wrestling, which would serve as another viable wrestling promotion for up-and-coming or neglected talent to shine and earn a living. TNA would struggle for a couple of years before eventually picking up a TV deal and debuting Impact Wrestling, which would soon gain a cult following. With the company bringing in some major innovations to the wrestling scene, such as unique match types, a 6-sided ring, and fresh young talent that the WWE fans were unfamiliar with, TNA gained a lot of buzz in the wrestling world and for a short time was on track to becoming somewhat of a threat to the WWE. While TNA has had some serious ups and downs in its history, it wouldn't even exist had it not been for those contract negotiations all the way back in 1999, when its founder, Jeff Jarrett, held up Vince McMahon for the money he was owed and showed McMahon and the WWF no mercy.